The courtroom feels less like a chamber of justice and more like a stage about to erupt. The air is thick with cameras, flashes slicing through silence. Every cough echoes, every shift in a seat sounds like thunder. And there, at the center of it all, sits Justice Clarence Thomas, calm, collected, certain. He leans forward, the faintest smirk curling on his lips. Across from him, Representative Jasmine Crockett adjusts her mic. No fidgeting, no nerves, just stillness, the kind that makes even the walls hold their breath. Thomas clears his throat, voice low but edged like a blade. "Congresswoman," he begins, "I appreciate your enthusiasm for the law, though I can't say I've seen much evidence of your understanding of it." Laughter ripples through the room, forced, nervous, like people laughing at a joke they know might get them in trouble. The smirk widens. Cameras zoom. Headlines are already writing themselves. But Crockett doesn't move. She doesn't blink. Her eyes stay locked on him, not with anger, but with the unshakable calm of someone who's seen this game 100 times before. In the back, aides exchange glances. Someone mutters, "Oh no, he didn't." But yes, he did. Thomas leans back, satisfied. That's the move: dismiss, diminish, dominate. The playbook hasn't changed in decades. He thinks the round is his. The gavel taps once. A murmur spreads, like static before a storm. The whole room feels the shift, the kind you can't see, only sense. Then Crockett speaks. Softly at first, almost conversational. "Justice Thomas," she says, her voice clear, measured, dangerous in its restraint, "I understand far more than you think. In fact, I understand you better than you'd like me to." The air freezes. That calm tone carries more weight than a shout ever could. Cameras click. You can almost hear the nation leaning closer to the screen. Her expression doesn't change, but his does. The smirk flickers, just slightly. Enough to show he felt it. Enough to signal this isn't going the way he expected. And that's the moment, the exact second when silence becomes power, when the smirk starts to look like doubt. He thought he was schooling her. What happened next? History. No one expected her answer, not even him. Rewind. Before the silence, before that smirk began to fade, before millions would replay the clip in disbelief, there was the hearing. A routine oversight session, or at least that's what everyone thought. Another round of formalities, cameras, and polite evasions about judicial ethics. The kind of Washington theater where power performs integrity and everyone pretends to believe it. But this time, something felt different. Justice Clarence Thomas sat at the witness table, posture stiff, reputation bruised. The country had been whispering for months: luxury vacations, billionaire benefactors, undisclosed gifts, the kind of whispers that echo louder than words. He'd come to clarify, but the smirk said otherwise. To him, this was a nuisance, not a reckoning. And then came Jasmine Crockett. Her entrance wasn't loud or dramatic, it didn't need to be. She carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who knows how to make the powerful sweat. Young, sharp, unapologetically direct. She wasn't here to play nice. She was here to ask what others wouldn't. To remind the country that even the robed elite could bleed accountability. The contrast was cinematic. He was the old guard, insulated by decades, cushioned by tradition, wrapped in robes of unquestioned authority. She was the new voice, bold, unbothered, representing a generation that had stopped asking for permission to speak truth. The headlines had teased it days before: Crockett takes on courtroom royalty. Social media buzzed with curiosity. What could a congresswoman really say to a Supreme Court justice? The answer was about to rewrite expectations. The gavel came down. "Proceed, Congresswoman Crockett." She didn't waste a second. "Justice Thomas," she began, tone even, words deliberate, "do you believe the American people deserve full transparency from those who interpret their laws?" He smiled. A practiced smile, the kind that hides irritation. "Congresswoman, I believe the American people deserve a functioning government that respects separation of powers." There it was, the dodge wrapped in dignity. But she didn't blink. "So you're saying transparency is optional?" A pause. He shifted, ever so slightly. Around them, the hearing room crackled. Journalists scribbled. Staffers looked up from their notes. Crockett leaned in. "Because, respectfully, the public's patience with optional accountability seems to be wearing thin." The sentence hit harder than any shout could. She was no longer talking to him, she was talking for the people watching, the ones who'd been told to trust systems that never trusted them back. Thomas adjusted his glasses, tone cool but clipped. "Congresswoman, I don't respond to insinuations." But the room already knew he had. Outside the chamber, networks began breaking in. Tweets multiplied. Clips spread. The story wasn't just about judicial ethics anymore. It was about power, privilege, and who gets to define justice in America. The old guard versus the new voice. It wasn't just symbolism. It was generational, ideological, emotional, and Jasmine Crockett wasn't just questioning Clarence Thomas. She was questioning everything he represented. The tension was no longer in what was said but in what was felt. Everyone thought this was just another hearing, another day of politics as usual. But that was before the balance shifted, before a congresswoman looked a Supreme Court justice dead in the eye and made him answer questions no one else dared to ask. And in that moment, the power dynamic flipped. For more than 3 decades, Justice Clarence Thomas had been an immovable object on the Supreme Court, a man who rarely spoke but always made himself heard through his rulings. He was the silent force, the marble statue of conservatism carved into the heart of American law. While others filled the air with opinions and arguments, Thomas was the quiet thunder in the background, rarely visible, but always there. He had outlasted presidencies, scandals, movements, and generational change. Appointed in the early 90s, he came into the court as an outsider, a black conservative in a nation that didn't quite know what to make of him. To some, he was the embodiment of self-reliance, proof that conservative ideals transcended race. To others, he was a contradiction, a man who climbed the ladder of opportunity and then pulled it up behind him. Decade after decade, he wrote opinions that solidified his legend, hardline, uncompromising, drenched in a philosophy that saw government not as protector, but as intruder. He became the standard-bearer of originalism, that belief that the Constitution speaks most clearly when it sounds like the 18th century. His rulings shaped the boundaries of rights and liberties for generations, often quietly but decisively. He didn't need the spotlight. Power came to him regardless. But silence, as the years went on, began to sound less like wisdom and more like calculation. The legend began to fray around the edges. Whispers grew louder, not about his legal philosophy, but about his lifestyle. Private jets, yacht vacations, and billionaire benefactors whose generosity was hidden from public record. Reports emerged of undisclosed gifts, secret retreats, and favors exchanged beneath the sheen of judicial integrity. The image of the stoic justice began to blur into something else, something self-serving, untouchable, and deeply political. It was as if the robe that once symbolized impartiality had become armor, shielding him from consequence. And with every revelation, the myth cracked just a little more. Cable news rolled old footage: Thomas at past hearings, stone-faced, answering questions with the patience of a man who knew time was on his side. In one clip, a senator asked about influence and impartiality. His reply, calm but cold, "I do not answer to public opinion." It sounded noble once. Now it sounded like defiance. The public began connecting dots. Billionaire Harlan Crow, the man whose name would soon become inseparable from Thomas's, had funded lavish vacations, bought properties from his family, even paid for a relative's tuition. None of it disclosed. None of it explained. And yet, when questioned, Thomas claimed it was all friendship. Nothing unethical. Nothing unusual. The myth cracked again. In op-eds and podcasts, people debated whether he'd simply grown too comfortable, too insulated, too convinced that the rules that applied to everyone else didn't reach as high as the bench he sat on. The same bench where, year after year, he voted to limit oversight, to curb transparency, to keep the powerful safe from the gaze of accountability. It was a kind of irony only Washington could produce, the man tasked with upholding the highest ethical standards appearing to live far below them. And yet, even as stories surfaced and criticism grew, Thomas didn't waver. He didn't lash out or retreat. He smiled, sat back, and waited. Because that was his gift, patience. He had weathered storms before: scandals, hearings, cultural revolutions. He'd learned that time erases outrage, and power forgives itself. So he stayed silent, stayed seated, stayed smug. But the silence that once commanded respect now made people uneasy. The same composure that once read as confidence now looked like arrogance. He wasn't explaining, defending, or denying. He was daring the world to keep trying. That was the real myth, not his brilliance, not his longevity, but his invincibility. The belief that no one could touch him. That the robes, the title, the decades of service formed an invisible shield. Until that day. Until that hearing. Until that voice, sharp, young, unapologetic, spoke without fear. Because for all the years he'd sat behind marble walls and mahogany benches, untouched and unquestioned, no one had ever looked him in the eye and refused to play his game. For years, no one had dared challenge him so directly until now. Jasmine Crockett never planned to become a symbol. She didn't enter politics for the spotlight or the headlines. She came from the kind of world that never expected a woman like her to stand behind a congressional mic, staring down Supreme Court justices. Her story didn't start in marble halls. It started in crowded courtrooms that smelled of sweat, fear, and cheap coffee, the kind where public defenders fight to keep people's lives from collapsing under the weight of the system. That's where she learned the rhythm of power. The way prosecutors could twist a story, the way judges could rush a sentence, the way the poor, the tired, the unheard got steamrolled because they couldn't afford the luxury of defense. For Jasmine, justice was never theory, it was survival. In those early years, she didn't have much more than a second-hand briefcase and a voice that carried like thunder. She'd walk into courtrooms where the bailiff barely looked up, where no one expected her to win. But win she did not with theatrics, but with facts sharp enough to cut through arrogance. She made juries listen, forced judges to look up, and reminded everyone that the Constitution wasn't written for the comfortable alone. She didn't just represent clients, she represented a principle that the law was supposed to serve everyone. That justice, to mean anything, had to see beyond titles, money, and old boy networks. Years later, when she entered Congress, that same fire followed her. She didn't come in as part of a political dynasty or a polished insider circle. She came in loud, focused, unapologetic. Her first committee hearings made waves not because she shouted, but because she refused to be silenced. When others danced around the truth, she walked straight through it. Her reputation grew, a lawmaker who asked the questions others were too afraid to touch. She understood the weight of her voice. Every word she spoke carried the echoes of those who didn't get the chance to speak for themselves. When critics called her too direct, she smiled. When pundits labeled her abrasive, she replied, "I'm not abrasive, I'm accurate." That was Jasmine Crockett, calm under fire, razor-sharp with logic, and bold enough to call out hypocrisy, no matter how high it sat. Her rise wasn't about ambition, it was about necessity. She'd seen too many lives ruined by systems designed to look fair but built to favor the powerful. She wasn't in Congress to fit in, she was there to remind people that accountability isn't optional. There were nights she'd sit in her office long after cameras stopped rolling, replaying the day's hearing in her mind. She'd think about the faces of those she used to defend, young, scared, forgotten, and wonder if any of them saw her now. If they knew someone was still fighting from inside the walls that once seemed impenetrable. Flashbacks filled her mind like film reels, the young attorney cross-examining a smug prosecutor. The woman who stood her ground when an older judge tried to dismiss her motion with a smirk. The headlines that began to change tone, from skepticism to respect. Her mother used to tell her, if they don't listen the first time, make them listen the second. And if they still don't, change the whole damn room. Jasmine took that to heart. By the time she faced Justice Thomas, she wasn't some rookie politician chasing clout. She was a battle-tested truth-teller who had spent years dismantling arrogance brick by brick. She'd faced men like him before, the ones who underestimated her, misread her composure for compliance, mistook her courtesy for weakness. But there was a difference this time. This wasn't a local courtroom. This was the national stage, the heartbeat of democracy under the lens of millions. And yet, as she walked into that hearing room, she didn't feel intimidated. She felt ready, because everything in her life had been training for this. Every late-night case file, every dismissal, every door slammed in her face. All of it had built her for this confrontation. The stakes were bigger than one exchange. They were about who gets to define truth in America. As she sat down across from Clarence Thomas, she wasn't just representing herself. She was representing every woman who'd been spoken over, every young lawyer told she was too emotional, every person who'd been told justice wasn't for people like them. Her voice carried not just her story, but 1,000 others. The cameras might have seen one congresswoman versus one Supreme Court justice. But she knew better. This wasn't a duel of titles, it was a duel of worlds. One built on comfort, the other on conviction. One insulated by power, the other hardened by struggle. So when he leaned back in his chair, smirk curling, and mocked her credentials with that patronizing tone he'd perfected over years of unchecked authority, he wasn't just mocking Jasmine Crockett. He was mocking every woman who had to fight twice as hard to be heard. Every young black attorney who'd been told to wait their turn. Every American who'd ever been told the rules didn't work the same for them as they did for the powerful. He wasn't just mocking her, he was mocking everyone she fights for. The air in the hearing room felt electric, the kind of charged quiet before a thunderstorm. Cameras blinked red, microphones glowed, and the country waited. Justice Clarence Thomas sat there, still as a statue, but his smirk said everything. This won't take long. Across from him, Jasmine Crockett adjusted her mic, calm, collected, the same poise she'd worn in every courtroom that ever tried to underestimate her. The chair recognized her for questioning, and instantly, you could feel the audience lean in. Crockett, Justice Thomas, I want to begin with a simple question, one that doesn't require a law degree to answer. Do you believe that public trust in the court still exists? Thomas chuckled low, dismissive. Thomas, Congresswoman, I believe the American people are capable of separating media noise from reality. A murmur ran through the room. It wasn't the words, it was the tone. That slow, condescending rhythm. Like a professor humoring a student who'd overstepped. Crockett smiled, unfazed. Right. The media noise. So when we talk about undisclosed gifts, private jets, and donors who conveniently appear in your rulings, that's just static. Thomas straightened slightly, eyes narrowing. Thomas, I don't respond to insinuations. I've served this nation with integrity for over 30 years. Respect, Congresswoman, is something I've earned. Crockett, and yet, Justice, respect isn't a lifetime appointment. It's renewed through transparency. A reporter in the back stifled a laugh that one landed. Thomas shifted in his seat, the smirk flickering for the first time. Thomas, Congresswoman, perhaps when you've spent more than a few years interpreting the Constitution, you'll appreciate the gravity of these discussions. There it was, the barb, the quiet venom of hierarchy. Crockett didn't flinch. She leaned forward, voice steady. With all due respect, Justice, some of us learned gravity long before we had titles. My constituents live it every day. The gallery went still. He blinked, almost startled by the precision of her tone. Thomas, you're implying I don't understand hardship. Crockett, I'm implying you've forgotten what it looks like from the ground up. The words hit like a gavel. Thomas tried to laugh it off, leaning back. Congresswoman, you seem very passionate. But passion doesn't replace jurisprudence. Crockett tilted her head, her expression calm, surgical. No, it doesn't. But neither does privilege. A gasp rippled through the room. You could almost hear the collective inhale of every political commentator about to clip that moment. Thomas's pen tapped the desk once, twice a nervous tell. Thomas, I won't sit here and be lectured by someone who, Crockett, who what, Justice, who hasn't vacationed with billionaires, who hasn't had their influence underwritten by friends of convenience. Boom. The words dropped like a hammer. Even the stenographer hesitated. For the first time, Thomas didn't have a comeback. His silence said more than any rebuttal could. The tension in the room was palpable. You could hear the faint hum of the air conditioner, the clicking of keys from the press benches, the sound of political history being written in real time. Crockett leaned back slightly, hands folded, eyes locked on him. Crockett, this isn't about politics, Justice. It's about accountability. The robe doesn't make you untouchable. It makes you responsible. A pause. Long, heavy. The kind of silence that swallows a room whole. Thomas finally looked up, but the authority in his gaze had dimmed. Thomas, are you accusing me of corruption? Crockett, I'm saying corruption hides best behind confidence. The audience breathed again, but quieter now, like they were afraid to break the spell. A staffer at the far end dropped a pen, and it sounded like a gunshot. Thomas glanced toward the committee chair, visibly irritated. Mr. Chairman, this line of questioning, Crockett interrupted, voice rising just enough to command the floor. Crockett, with all due respect, I'm not done. The chair didn't stop her. No one did. She leaned forward one last time, her tone dropping to a whisper that carried like thunder through every microphone in that chamber. Crockett, you mocked my experience, Justice Thomas. But experience isn't what makes someone credible, truth does. And right now, the truth isn't on your side. Silence. Total, breathless silence. No pen tapping, no whispers, just the sound of a legacy cracking under the weight of one perfectly aimed line. And then in one breath she flipped the room. The pause hung there, electric, deliberate, dangerous. You could almost feel the sound being sucked out of the room. Jasmine Crockett didn't rush it. She let the silence stretch until even Justice Thomas began to shift in his chair, that smug certainty thinning into unease. She leaned forward, voice low but steady. Justice Thomas, she began, you've sat on this bench for decades preaching about integrity, about restraint, about fidelity to the Constitution. But somewhere along the way, fidelity turned into favoritism. The words landed clean, surgical. You could hear camera shutters stutter, not clicks anymore, but gasps captured in frame. Thomas adjusted his robe, jaw tight. Congresswoman, you're mischaracterizing. Crockett raised a hand, calm as glass. I'm quoting you. A hush, sharper now. She continued, her tone unhurried, every word measured, layered, unstoppable. In your 2001 address to the Federalist Society, you said, and I quote, when we forget that power corrupts, we have already invited corruption into our house of justice. Those were your words, Justice. So tell me, when did the invitation go out? A murmur rolled through the chamber. Thomas blinked once, twice. The smile that had once been armor began to tremble. Crockett pressed on. You accepted gifts from a billionaire with cases before your court. You failed to disclose trips worth more than most Americans' annual salaries. And when asked about it, you called it friendship. She leaned back slightly. If that's friendship, the American people could use a few of those friends because they can't even afford rent. The audience reacted a soft rustle, then scattered applause quickly silenced by the gavel. But the damage was done. The oxygen in the room belonged to her now. Thomas tried to recover, his tone clipped. "Congresswoman, I do not appreciate being accused of impropriety without evidence." Crockett's response was instant. "Impropriety doesn't vanish because you choose not to see it. The evidence isn't hidden, it's filed, photographed, and reported. What's missing," she said, leaning forward again, "is accountability." The line hit like a thunderclap. He folded his hands tightly, knuckles whitening. "You are politicizing the judiciary." She smiled just slightly. "No, Justice. The judiciary politicized itself when it stopped pretending to serve the people and started serving those who could afford proximity." The air snapped a collective intake of breath, the sound of decorum shattering. She wasn't yelling. She didn't need to. Her calm was more lethal than outrage. Every pause carried intent, every syllable landed like evidence in a closing argument. Crockett gestured toward the dais. "You've lectured generations about respect for institutions. But tell me, how do you expect Americans to respect institutions that no longer respect them?" He tried to interject again, but she didn't yield an inch. "Integrity," she said, voice soft but cutting, "isn't something you wear like a robe. It's something you earn, and keep, and live by, especially when no one's watching. So when you mock my credentials, remember I didn't inherit my seat. I earned it." The room went still. Cameras zoomed in. The tension was cinematic, heartbeat slow, the kind of suspense you could measure in silence. Thomas's smile faltered completely now. You could see it, the flicker of disbelief, the rare glimpse of a man who'd never been challenged like this publicly. Crockett's next words came out cool and precise. "You've ruled on cases about disclosure, about fairness, about the very ethics you now dismiss as optional. So let me be crystal clear, what you call media noise is the sound of democracy knocking, and it's not leaving the doorstep this time." The journalists' pens froze. Phones lifted. You could hear whispers ripple down the press row. Did she just end him? Crockett didn't blink. Her expression was steady, unreadable. Thomas inhaled sharply, as if preparing a retort, but the words never came. She struck again. "The American people don't expect perfection, but they do expect honesty. And when honesty disappears from the highest court in the land, justice follows it out the door." Her voice didn't rise, it deepened, calm, unflinching, devastating. "I'm not here to embarrass you, Justice Thomas. I'm here to remind you. The robe you wear represents a promise that the law belongs to everyone, not just those rich enough to bend it." That was the hit, the one that took the air out of the chamber. Even Thomas didn't move. His gaze dropped for a fraction of a second, imperceptible, but real. Crockett let the silence breathe. 10 seconds, maybe more. You could hear the hum of the overhead lights, the buzz of recording equipment, the steady thump of someone's racing pulse. Then, finally, she spoke one last line, soft enough to make everyone lean in. "Justice Thomas," she said, her tone smooth as ice, "if integrity were currency, this court would be bankrupt." The words echoed through the chamber like a verdict. Every phone lit up. Every reporter scrambled for the quote. Thomas didn't answer. He didn't have to. His silence was the answer. The gavel struck once, but it sounded hollow, like ceremony trying to contain history. Crockett gathered her notes, eyes forward, and stood. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. Because in that moment, everyone in that room, every senator, staffer, journalist, every American watching through a screen knew the truth. That one sentence would travel faster than any ruling he'd ever written. The moment the words, "if integrity were currency, this court would be bankrupt," hit the airwaves, the internet detonated. By sunset, clips of Jasmine Crockett's takedown had flooded every corner of social media. Twitter, or what was left of it, caught fire first. The hashtags came in waves. Hashtag Crockett vs. Thomas, hashtag Mic Drop Justice, hashtag accountability now. Within an hour, her name was trending #1 nationwide. The clip, just 57 seconds long, had already crossed 3 million views before the first primetime anchor even said her name. Cable news scrambled to catch up. MSNBC cut into regular programming. Breaking now: a fiery exchange in Congress where Representative Jasmine Crockett delivers a pointed rebuke to Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas over ethics concerns. CNN looped the footage with the caption, "The moment power blinked." Fox News tried to downplay it, another partisan stunt, but even their commentators couldn't hide the shift in tone. One panelist, reluctantly, admitted, she owned that room. He didn't have a comeback. By morning, the clip had become a cultural Rorschach test. On TikTok, creators reenacted the moment, dramatic music swelling as Crockett's line dropped, then cut to slow-motion reaction shots. Edits layered with storm sound effects, courtroom echo filters, even animated lightning bolts behind her as she delivered the final words. Someone spliced her voice over an orchestral track and titled it, Symphony of Accountability. It went viral on Instagram Reels. Another turned it into a motivational remix on YouTube called, When Truth Walks in Wearing Heels. Late-night hosts pounced. On The Daily Show, the audience roared as the clip played on loop. The host smirked. Justice Thomas tried to flex and Jasmine Crockett hit him with the legal equivalent of deleting his browser history. Laughter erupted. Applause thundered. By the next morning, memes were everywhere. A still of Thomas's fading smirk captioned, When the group project finally asks for receipts. Another showed Crockett walking away from the hearing table with fire emojis trailing behind her shoes. But beyond the memes, something heavier stirred. Commentators called it a cultural exhale, that rare moment when arrogance met resistance, and resistance didn't flinch. Cable roundtables framed it as symbolic justice. It wasn't just about one exchange, one pundit said. It was about an entire generation of Americans watching someone finally talk back to power with evidence, with elegance, and with zero fear. Op-eds poured in. The Atlantic called it, a modern rebuke written in real time. Rolling Stone dubbed it, the day accountability got its voice back. Even conservative outlets couldn't ignore the optics, the image of a young black congresswoman standing firm before one of the most powerful men in America. Polls showed a spike in her name recognition overnight. Campaign donations trickled in. Her staff inbox overflowed with messages from single moms, public defenders, teachers, veterans, people who said they felt seen. On Reddit threads and Facebook pages, the conversation shifted. It wasn't just about Thomas anymore. It was about power, privilege, and the idea that maybe, just maybe, someone was finally saying out loud what millions had been thinking for years. And through it all, Jasmine Crockett stayed silent. Her team released no statement, no press tour, no victory lap, just a brief tweet. Accountability isn't an attack. It's a promise. 10 words. Calm, controlled, decisive. It sent chills. Meanwhile, Thomas's office issued a terse response, Justice Thomas will not engage in political spectacle. But by then, the spectacle was already history. The silence from his camp only amplified hers. On college campuses, law students dissected her questioning technique. Legal podcasts broke down her rhetorical precision. She hadn't interrupted, hadn't raised her voice, and yet she'd dismantled decades of perceived invulnerability with logic alone. And maybe that's why it hit so hard. Because for once, the scales of power tilted not by shouting, not by chaos, but by calm conviction. People called it a mic drop moment, but those who knew better understood. It was more like a mirror held up to a system that had long refused to see itself. Across comment sections, one sentiment kept repeating, she didn't just speak for herself. She spoke for all of us who never get the mic. Justice Thomas, for all his experience and stature, had become a symbol not just of judicial conservatism, but of untouchable power. Crockett's challenge cracked that image, even if just for a moment. And that moment mattered. It wasn't about humiliating a justice. It was about reclaiming something that had slipped away from public faith, the belief that truth could still win in a room full of titles and traditions. The country, weary and cynical, had been waiting for a scene like this, one that felt like justice, even if symbolic. And when Crockett delivered it, people didn't just cheer, they felt it. It was catharsis disguised as accountability, a release long overdue. But for Jasmine Crockett, this wasn't about going viral. It was about the bigger picture. In the quiet that followed, something rare happened. America paused. The shouting match that usually defined politics gave way to a kind of silence that felt restorative. It wasn't the silence of defeat, but of realization, of recognition. Because in that single exchange, Jasmine Crockett hadn't just challenged a justice, she'd reminded a nation of what accountability looks like. Calm, informed, unstoppable. She didn't swing her words like weapons, she set them down like evidence. And one by one, they built a truth too solid to ignore. In an era when outrage is currency and noise is power, Crockett proved the opposite, that composure can cut deeper than shouting ever could. That truth, spoken softly but firmly, can echo longer than any speech written in fury. Power speaks loudest when it doesn't need to raise its voice. That's what people felt when they watched her. Pride, relief, permission to believe that facts still matter, that courage still counts, and that the system, flawed as it is, can still be shaken by a single unwavering voice. Her calm was more than poise, it was rebellion. A declaration that dignity wasn't weakness, it was weaponry. For every young lawyer watching, for every woman of color told to tone it down, for every worker dismissed by someone who thought their title made them untouchable, Crockett became proof that grace could still win a fight. And that's what made it revolutionary. She didn't scream, she didn't gloat, she didn't even smile when the world crowned her moment viral. Because to her, This wasn't theater, it was duty. She wasn't chasing applause, she was restoring balance. It wasn't about the clip, or the hashtag, or the headlines. It was about something older, something truer. The idea that power must always answer to the people, not the other way around. She reminded us that justice isn't a statue carved in marble, it's a living thing. It breathes through those willing to hold it up, even when their hands shake. And when Thomas's smirk faded, it wasn't just personal vindication, it was a glimpse of accountability finally staring power in the face. Some called it political theater, but for millions, it felt like moral clarity. A moment when right didn't just sound good, it looked good. Because every now and then, politics produces poetry, and this was it. A congresswoman with the audacity to demand answers. A justice too used to silence to see it coming. A nation that watched the balance of deference and defiance tilt, even for a heartbeat, toward justice. In that hearing room, under the cold lights and unblinking cameras, dignity outshined dominance. Truth eclipsed legacy. And somewhere between a question and an answer, America remembered itself. Not the cynical, divided, exhausted version, but the one that still believes courage matters. The one that still roots for the underdog. The one that still thinks a single sentence can move the needle of history. That's why it resonated. Because Crockett's calm wasn't just for her. It was for everyone who's ever been spoken down to, laughed off, or overlooked. She stood her ground, and in doing so, she gave others permission to do the same. And so the story didn't end when the gavel struck. It began there, rippling outward, whispered across feeds and classrooms and kitchen tables. Because if one voice can silence a justice, imagine what millions could do. The smirk that started it all gone. The man who'd once seemed untouchable sat in silence, while the woman he tried to belittle left the room as the embodiment of composure and conviction. Justice Thomas had spent a lifetime defining power through silence. Jasmine Crockett redefined it in a single sentence. Because integrity doesn't bow to titles. It doesn't kneel before robes, or ranks, or reputations built on years of unchallenged authority. It stands tall, steady, clear, undeniable, even when the odds say it shouldn't. That's what this moment was really about. Not a viral clip, not political theater, but proof that truth, when spoken without fear, still has the power to change the temperature of an entire room, even a courtroom built to intimidate. And if that kind of courage moves you, then don't let it end here. If you believe in voices like hers, in grace under fire, in accountability that doesn't back down, make sure this story keeps echoing. Like, share, subscribe. Because the fight for integrity doesn't live in headlines, it lives in us. In every person who refuses to stay quiet when it matters most. Crockett didn't just win an argument, she sparked a reminder. That dignity is still louder than arrogance. That facts still cut deeper than power. And that when courage meets clarity, even the mighty must listen. One question, one moment, and the courtroom was never the same again.